Welcome to Meet the Authors with Dr. Philip Levin, this show devoted to regional Southern writers. At this show, we'll feature interviews with local authors and other literary agents of the coast, including book agents, librarians, editors, and publishers. Mississippi is steeped in the history of Southern literature. Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winners like Eudora Welty, Tennessee Williams, William Faulkner, Richard Wright, Shelby Foote, and newer authors, Greg Wright and John Grisham, all Mississippi natives who have brought great literature to this country. Myself, I was raised in literature. My mother was an author who published over 30 books and 1,000 articles. My father published poetry after he retired, over 200 poems. I love writing. I personally have published over 22 books, and I really enjoy the opportunity to bring other authors to your living room and bring out Southern literature at its greatest. We also have in the community the Gulf Coast Writers Association. It's the largest organization in Mississippi for writers. If you or someone you know is interested in being a writer, contact us at www.gcwriters.org. Today's show is going to feature 3 local authors. We have first off Johnny Bernhard with her new book, A Good Girl, a wonderful book about the evolution of a family who comes across from Europe and is raised in the South, all the features thereof. We'll follow that up with Lucy Slagle's book, Camellia Creek, a wonderful book based on the Civil War, as you can tell by the cover, and the history thereof. Our final guest for today will be Elaine McDermott. Elaine McDermott is the 2017 Mississippi Poet of the Year. Wonderful poems that you all will enjoy. So in just a few minutes after this commercial break, we'll be right back and share with you, members of the South, this wonderful experience of meeting Southern writers here on Meet the Authors with Dr. Philip Levin. Welcome back to Meet the Authors with Dr. Philip Levin. Today's first guest on today's show is Johnny Bernhard. Johnny Bernhard has a long history of literary establishment. She was an English major. She has a career as a literary agent, and now she's gone into publishing her own book. She's here to talk about her first book, and we'd like to welcome Johnny Bernhard to our show. Johnny, hello.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for having me on your debut program. Very pleased to be here.
I'm so glad. We're glad to have you. So tell us a little bit about your interest in writing. How did you get started?
Well, I think that reading and writing are entwined. I loved to read as a child. I read the Laura Ingalls Wilder series. I was crazy about Nancy Drew. I wrote very bad poetry in junior high and high school, kept a journal, went on to get a bachelor's in journalism and worked in newspaper, did some freelance for magazine, a lot of nonfiction work. But it wasn't until the last few years that I was no longer required to work a 40, 60-hour week that I began dabbling in fiction. And A Good Girl is my debut fiction novel. It's literary fiction / Southern.
It's a wonderful book. I really enjoyed that. And I enjoy reading those same type of books. When I was growing up, I was reading the Hardy Boys and got into all those type of literary things. So tell us a little bit, your journalism, what kind of journalism were you doing?
Well, I lived in Houston for a while. I had received my bachelor's at the University of Houston. I worked on the student newspaper there. I was in the yearbook. I worked for a newspaper in Southwest Houston called the Suburban Reporter that was working with all of those new neighborhoods west of Memorial. I went on to write for newspapers and magazines wherever we lived. I was very happy to follow my husband's career. He's a naval architect, so I've lived all over the Gulf Coast from Florida to Texas.
And that's how you ended up here, huh?
That is how I came to this area, which I love. It's a very comfortable place to live, and it's very rich in the arts. Once I decided to step up with fiction writing, I got in touch with you and the Gulf Coast Writers Association, which I think is very important for any writer that is serious to have the support of a writing group for not only critique, but also to learn about all the elements of writing, from editing to developmental editing to what makes great plot and how to write great dialogue.
That's so true. I mean, we really have to get with other authors and learn the techniques. Speaking of which, tell us about your book. How exciting to get your first book out into print. Who's published it? And tell us a little bit about the book itself.
A Good Girl is historical fiction / Southern fiction. It is the saga of a family for 6 generations. I've always been very curious about the immigrant stories of coming to America. So with this novel, I had the female coming from Ireland, leaving the potato famine of the 1840s and arriving on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Now, that is a true historical fact. That's how many of the Irish came to Texas. At the same time, the Germans were leaving Germany and coming to the Republic of Texas before it became part of the U.S. At that time, that republic was giving very large land grants, and it made it very affordable and appealing to immigrants to settle there.
So tell us a little bit, read us a little bit from the book. I've read some of that book. I really loved it. Was captivated by the realism about the coming alive issues of being part of the immigrant story. We really have enjoyed this book very much, and your professional writing just draws one in. So we have, give us about 45 seconds and read us a little bit.
Thank you, I'd be happy to. This is from chapter 22, Faith, Hope, and Love. The November sky above the Gulf of Mexico was cast the same hue as the water below it. Gracie couldn't tell where the sky ended and the water began as she drove along the coastal road from Pass Christian to Biloxi. She slowed the car to 35 miles an hour, stunned by the palest of blues that washed the delineation line between land, water, and sky. The neap tide, just after the first quarter of the moon, erased the depths of high and low water along the shoreline. Perhaps it was the season's first cold front, creating the visual illusion of heaven and earth as one. She had left the house early that morning to interview a fisherman for the Biloxi Times. She met him at the Pass Christian harbor at early dawn.
That is wonderful. Where can readers get a copy of this book?
Well, I'm very proud to say it is at St. Alphonsus Catholic Church Bookstore, Barnes & Noble, Poppy's on Washington Avenue, Pass Christian Books, Bay Books of St. Louis, the Mary C. O'Keefe Cultural Arts Center, and Triplet Day in downtown Gulfport, as well as Amazon. I'd really like to do a shout out to readers that are curious about the book to support our independent bookstores along the coast.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for coming with us, Johnny. It's so glad to have you as our guest.
Thank you, Philip.
Next, be sure you pick up your copy of A Good Girl at the many places she's mentioned. Next up, we're proud to have Lucy Slagle with her new book, Camellia Creek. Hold on, we'll be right back after these messages. And welcome back to Meet the Authors with Dr. Philip Levin. We're honored to have as our second guest, Lucy Slagle, who is the author of several of these historical fiction books that really bring to life the sense of the drama of living in Mississippi during the historical war periods. The one we'll be speaking about tonight is Camellia Creek, a wonderful historical book about the Civil War. So Lucy, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your writing.
Well, like Johnny, I'm a reader. I've always read. My loves when I was growing up were not only reading, but history. And I started out with Trixie Belden and the Dana sisters, which was the same authors that did the Nancy Drew series. I graduated up to Zane Grey and Max Brand, and then by the time I was in high school, I was reading the Franks Yerby and Slaughter. And then after I went to college, I joined the Navy, got married, and I escaped into escape fiction. I read a lot of romance, and by the time I had retired from the Navy, got my last baby in kindergarten, I decided I could write a romance, and I was sure I could improve on it, but found out that the publishers already had what they wanted, and what I was actually writing was mainstream fiction with a sensual romance.
These are wonderful books. How many books do you have published now?
I have 6 published. This is my 5th one, but I wanted to talk about it because it's the prequel to a sequel.
A prequel to a sequel, I like that. And one of the things I just want to mention here to our audience is her books have won all these marvelous awards. First, gold medals from independent publishers companies and silver medals, and she has a big following. Every time we go out to our shows together, she has all these people coming to buy her books because she has a wonderful reputation. If you haven't read one of her books yet, you're in for a real treat. So tell us about this book, Camellia Creek. Tell what it's said, tell us about it.
Camellia Creek is set in the fall of 1865 during presidential Reconstruction in Mississippi. It's the story of a Confederate officer who returns to his war-ravaged home in Claiborne County, and he's at risk of losing it, and he is determined that he will not lose it, whether it's by legal or illegal means, honorable or dishonorable. He's already sold part of his land to a carpetbagger. As it turns out, his road to solvency is the orphan niece of the carpetbagger, who, through no fault of her own, ends up vulnerable to him, and he's able to coerce her into marriage. And he brings her back to Camellia Creek, where she has to face his ghost, both figuratively and literally. And if I could, are we to the point to read?
We would love to have you read. This is a real treat. This is so well written. I'm always delighted to read this book and have Lucy now read in her own words. And before we get to that, I just want to mention that she writes under her pseudonym, Carlisle Russell.
Charles C.
Sorry, say it again.
Charles C. I
Charles
was named
C.
for my
Russell.
dad, Charles.
All right. Lucy, go ahead and read us our little section.
Okay, this is from chapter 1, and the heroine is exploring her uncle's property that he has just recently purchased from the hero. Vision blurred by tears, Alice shook the water from her cold fingers and watched. She frowned. The droplets pit the now placid surface of the creek, and on that mirrored surface the reflection of a young woman reached for her across the water. Alice jerked her head up, then rose and stumbled back 2 steps. No one stood on the opposite bank. The hackles rose along her spine. No one, at least, that she could see. She blinked, blur and tears forgotten. The creek flowed along as it had before, its surface turbulent to reflect anything but light and the muted colors of the forest. Hesitant to get close to the water now, Alice bent forward to make sure she'd really not seen anything, an image of herself, perhaps, beckoning her to oblivion.
That is a wonderful reading. It's beautiful. So tell us a little bit. This is a prequel to a sequel. So the sequel is called what?
The sequel is Honor's Banner. It continues the story of Camellia Creek. The hero of it is a United States Marine, and who is for the, United States Marine, but it continues the mystery that started in this book, which actually takes a second place to actually this is a ghost story, and it is really brought to life in the sequel.
How wonderful. Where can our readers find these books? Where can they purchase them?
This book, and my books are in the system, so they are distributed by Ingram. You can buy them at any bookstore. You can buy them at Amazon. You can buy them in any digital format through Smashwords, at Diesel Books, iBooks, and Barnes & Noble.
How wonderful. It's such an honor to have you. Lucy, thank you for joining us. We really enjoyed hosting you and look forward to reading more of your work.
And thank you for having me, Phil. I really appreciate the offer.
So, next up, after this commercial break, we have our third guest of the day. We have Elaine McDermott with her new book, By the Rivers of Babylon. Elaine McDermott is the Mississippi Poetry Society Poet of the Year, and her poetry is fabulous. Fortunately, we have an opportunity to listen to her, read some of her poems. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after these words. Welcome back to Meet the Authors with Dr. Philip Levin. This is our third segment in today's show, and I am absolutely delighted to have Elaine McDermott as our guest for this third segment. Elaine McDermott has produced loads of poetry, volumes of poetry, and she's here to present her newest book. It's called By the Rivers of Babylon, and it's got some just marvelous poems, and I can hardly wait to have her read some and tell us a little bit about her career as a poet. So Elaine, tell us about your interest in poetry.
Well, I think that began as a child. My grandmother used to read to me a lot nursery rhymes. I couldn't get enough of them, and that gave me a sense of rhythm and rhyme, and it just made me want to read poetry, write poetry, and I actually didn't start writing much until I was in high school. And then I began writing, and of course, after retirement, it was much easier to write a whole lot more, and I think I have written most of my poetry after that time.
And that's wonderful, and your poems are so marvelous. So tell us, what kind of subjects, what stimulates you to write a poem?
Well, there's so many things. Often, I get a lot of my poetry by listening to people. Someone can just say a little phrase that catches me, and next thing you know, I've got a poem out of it. A lot of my poetry has to do with loss and longing, and I have that in there. And it just, poetry, of course, is an experience. And you take that experience and then you kind of season it with imagination. And if you're lucky, your reader will internalize that experience and claim it for his own. And of course, I think that's the ambition of every writer. If you can evoke an emotion in your reader, then you're happy.
Absolutely. I love poetry. And I find I write in all genres, including poetry, and I find it takes me a year to write, say, a book, maybe a month to write a short story, but a poem, you write it over and over and over, because every word has to be perfect.
Exactly. You have got to find the exact word, and it's not unusual for me to spend a day looking for a word, changing it, going back to it, and by the time the day's over, I usually have the one I started with.
Oh, that's funny. Go back to the one you started with.
Yeah.
So, delight us. Let's hear one of your poems.
Okay, fine. Thank you. I'd love to read one. This is called Kumquats in Winter. Traveling through scattered towns, ending again at a churchyard in Monticello, I grow weary watching spotted cows fold into russet mounds, and I curse the steel-gray clouds. As I pass the old dairy farm, the sagging loft of the oaken barn staggers beneath the metallic shadow of a silver water tower. I remember when we buried Daddy on the land that the drought had seared to sand. You rode beside me then and spoke of a kinder God. Trailing the autumn wind, the wet wood scent of promised rain blends with freshly baled hay, stirring memories of green peanuts, of rain frogs and cricket songs, smokehouses and wooden churns, golden syrup and copper pans, of strawberries in spring and kumquats in winter.
Oh, that's wonderful. Kumquats in winter.
Yeah.
It really brings Mississippi history to life. I love that.
Oh, thank you.
You were kind enough to let me read one of your poems, so with the camera on me, I'm going to read one of Elaine's poems that really struck me as marvelous. This one is called The Spirit of Marie Laveau. It's whispered on a starless night that when the fog rolls in, Marie Laveau's seen in the streets, a woman, wild with gin. She had a lover long ago who proved to be untrue. She made a doll that looked like him and practiced her voodoo. At the Silver Slipper Palace, a chorus girl named Belle longed for Marie's dark-skinned Creole and placed him in her spell. Marie then made a man of clay. She dressed him bold and smart. She found a sharp and silver pin and stabbed him in the heart. He died that night in young Belle's arms. Marie went mad with pain. She made a doll that looked like Belle. She found her pin again. It's whispered on a stormy night that above the thunder's din, Marie is heard out in the streets, repenting of her sin. I love your poems.
Oh, thank you so much. You did a marvelous read on it.
Thank you, dear. So, is this is this your first book? How many books do you have out now?
Oh, I've had several out.
Uh-huh.
This is my latest one, By the Rivers of Babylon.
It's a wonderful book.
Oh,
where can our readers buy that?
Well, right now it's on the Gulf Coast Writers Association website, of course, and this weekend, Sunday, I'm having a signing at Our Lady of Fatima Parish from 2 to 4.
That's wonderful. So check out www.gcwriters.org, and you can find all of our guest books there, and we would love to have you become part of the writers group. So before we end for the night, first I want to thank Elaine for coming. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having
tonight.
me. It's been delightful. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. And as we end up, I'm just going to say goodbye to everybody here who's come and joined us tonight today on our show, and mention that we'll be having future shows with wonderful guests. I have Brenda Blount scheduled from Barnes & Nobles. I have several other local writers and editors, as I mentioned. So be sure and stay tuned and watch for our next episode of Meet the Authors with Dr. Philip Levin, right here on this station.